Do you think there's anything America did right that other countries still in pandemic can learn from? And then is there any anti-pandemic measures that other countries did that you feel is worth implementing in the USA?
I think the massive testing. The New York State alone surpassed South Korea in testing frequency.
Oh,
It's pretty impressive,
mm-hmm.
considering South Korea had been doing the most testing of anybody else. So I think of the things that were done right, at least in New York State, I can't speak for the rest of the country because we're just so fractured at this point. But I think if the United States did anything right, it was the emphasis on the testing, which unfortunately the president is moving to dismantle now because it makes him look bad. But
Mm-hmm.
that's a whole nother debate going on right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think the logistics of setting up field hospitals and acquiring ventilators and things like that, I think actually ended up being a good thing. Mm-hmm. But a lot of that had to do with, the National Guard, the Northeast Coalition of States. We had to form a new union within the union because the federal government wasn't doing its job. Mm-hmm. So, states like, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, they all had to band together to make this happen on their own. And they did a really good job of it. Mm-hmm. Examples of things in other countries that we should have done are numerous. Locking down sooner, contact tracing, like in a very serious way, like Japan did.
Oh, there's no contact tracing now in United States, like no forms of contact tracing?
They're contact tracing in New York State.
Oh.
I don't know the rest of the country.
Okay.
Oh, I know they're not contact tracing in Texas and Arizona. And it's, because they just never set up any kind of facility to do so. Mm-hmm. So it's the fractious nature of the country that I can't speak in a general sense to the United States.
Mm-hmm. So about the mass testing that you were talking about, right? So what was the criteria for New York State how do they choose or how do they decide when someone should be tested or when someone should not be tested?
As I understand it, since I have not been tested myself, mm-hmm. Because I didn't want to take a test away from someone who really needed it, mm-hmm. The requirements was you had to be symptomatic. Mm-hmm. At least, so like back in the early days, they had very, very, very few tests. Most of the tests were reserved for, police, emergency workers, military personnel, hospital workers, and someone who came in symptomatic of COVID-19, they just assumed they had it. Mm-hmm. And as a couple of weeks went by, the test became a little more common. There was still no good antibody test. There was still the PCR swab test. Mm-hmm. And so the state set out guidelines that if you were obviously symptomatic, if you had to call a hotline and they would basically interview you. And they'd be like, well, do you have this symptoms? And if it sounded like you had it, you had to go, they would give you a couple of numbers or places you could call that maybe had tests. And then a couple more weeks went by and they had mobile testing sites where you could definitely go and they would have tests, mm-hmm. but it was still only if you were symptomatic. And then a few more weeks went by and then the antibody test finally became available, and those were still reserved for emergency personnel. And now, as of, I think 3 weeks ago, tests are available of all three kinds to all New Yorkers whenever you need them.
Oh, okay. So you can actually volunteer to be tested if you want.
Yep. I could go out and get an antibody test tomorrow if I wanted to.
Oh, okay. Oh, so actually...
I will eventually have to do that.
Mm-hmm. But actually, that means actually, at least in New York State, in this aspect, you guys work really fast. Like, the capacity to test people, at least it increases very fast, actually.
Yeah, and it was crazy because, like, the state of New York governor and Cuomo gave these daily briefings, and like early on, it was always like, well, we can't get these you know, they're contracting, like New York State had something like 236 labs, maybe more, maybe it was 400 labs. And he's like, this is great. We have these labs. But the problem is the labs don't have reagents. And the only way we can get the reagents is from China. And the reason we can't get the reagents from China is the shipping is shut down due to travel restrictions. And it's like, you know, it's this crazy catch-22. So I don't know where they ended up getting reagents from. I would imagine probably Canada. But they finally got the reagents so they could run the PCR testing. As far as I understand it, the antibody tests are simpler chemically, so they don't need quite the mass quantities of laboratory chemicals to run the testing. But yeah, it was touch and go for a while there because they just didn't have the material to do it. But finally, the logistics fell into place and they were able to pull it off.